The television cameras rolled as 93-year-old Samuel Willenberg faced his former captor across a stark conference room table. Heinrich Brenner, once a guard at Treblinka death camp, now a frail man of 89, reached across the polished wood with trembling hands. This confrontation would redefine what the world expected from Holocaust survivors about mercy, justice, and the limits of human forgiveness. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while the scent of institutional coffee mingled with decades of unspoken trauma. Brenner's weathered fingers, which had once gripped a rifle at the gates of hell, now clasped together in supplication. The documentary crew had arranged this meeting in Berlin, February 12, 2008, believing they would capture a moment of healing that would satisfy audiences hungry for redemption narratives. "I have carried this burden for 65 years, Brenner whispered, his voice barely audible above the camera's mechanical whir. "Every night I see their faces. Every morning I wake with their screams in my ears. Please, Mr. Willenberg. I was young. I was following orders. I beg you to forgive me." The room fell silent except for the soft tick of an antique clock on the wall. Samuel Willenberg, survivor of the Treblinka uprising of 1943, the man who had escaped through razor wire and flames, studied his former tormentor with eyes that had witnessed the systematic murder of nearly 900,000 souls. What happened next would shock the filmmakers, the viewing audience, and challenge every assumption about how survivors should behave in the face of their oppressors' remorse. From the Berlin Documentation Center archives, February 12, 2008. Subject W declined reconciliation. Response verbatim, "No, I will not forgive you. Some acts exist beyond forgiveness." The cameras captured every second as Willenberg leaned forward, his voice steady and clear despite his advanced age. "You ask for my forgiveness, as if it were a commodity you could purchase with tears. But forgiveness is not mine to give for the murder of my friends, my family, and hundreds of thousands of innocent people. You participated in the greatest evil in human history. You do not deserve absolution, and I will not provide it." Brenner's face crumpled. The documentary crew exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was not the story they had come to tell. Some wounds refused to heal, but Willenberg's refusal to forgive was more than personal defiance. It was a declaration that would ripple through survivor communities worldwide, challenging the narrative that healing requires absolution and that victims owe their perpetrators peace. The aftermath of this televised confrontation would reveal something far more complex than a simple story of reconciliation denied. It would expose the machinery of forgiveness that society often demands from those who have suffered most, and the courage required to say no when the world expects yes. Before we explore what drove Willenberg to this moment of absolute refusal, I want to know where you are watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories of moral courage fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what you're about to learn about the true cost of survival will challenge everything you think you know about justice and mercy. But first, we must travel back to 1942, to a railroad siding in occupied Poland, where young Samuel Willenberg's journey into hell began with the screech of train wheels and the bark of German commands. The cattle car doors slammed open with a metallic shriek that would echo in Samuel Willenberg's nightmares for 7 decades. 20-year-old Samuel stumbled onto the platform at Treblinka, October 19, 1942, his nostrils burning from the acrid smoke that hung over the camp like a permanent storm cloud. This moment marked the beginning of a journey that would transform an ordinary young man into one of history's most uncompromising voices for justice. The wooden planks beneath his feet vibrated with the rumble of diesel engines, while the smell of burning flesh mixed with pine needles from the surrounding forest created a nauseating cocktail that no human should ever experience. Samuel's fingertips scraped against splintered wood as guards shoved the new arrivals into formation, their rifle butts leaving bruises that would fade long before the memories. Heinrich Brenner stood among those guards, his freshly pressed uniform marking him as one of the newer recruits to this machinery of death. At 24, Brenner had volunteered for what he believed would be routine camp duty, unaware that Treblinka existed for a single purpose: the complete annihilation of European Jewry. "Welcome to your new workplace," the camp commandant announced to the arriving transport. The cruel irony was intentional. Treblinka masqueraded as a labor camp, complete with fake train station signs pointing to fictional destinations like Bialystok and Wolkowisk. The deception kept victims calm until the final moment. Samuel possessed something his captors couldn't detect, and photographic memory that would later make him invaluable to historians documenting Nazi crimes. He absorbed every detail of the camp's layout, memorized guard rotations, and mentally cataloged the faces of perpetrators who believed their crimes would never be recorded. From Samuel Willenberg's testimony, Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, 1946. The entire camp operated like a factory. Human beings entered at one end, and only smoke emerged from the other. The new arrivals were divided into two groups: the elderly, women with children, and those deemed unfit for labor were directed toward what guards called the showers. Samuel, selected for his youth and apparent strength, was assigned to the work, detail responsible for sorting victims' belongings. This assignment saved his life while condemning him to witness atrocities that would reshape his understanding of human nature. In the sorting barracks, Samuel handled wedding rings still warm from their owners' fingers, children's toys abandoned in final moments of terror, and photographs of families who would never reunite. Brenner supervised these work details with mechanical efficiency. Unlike some guards who derived sadistic pleasure from cruelty, Brenner simply followed orders with the detached professionalism of a factory supervisor. This mundane evil would prove more haunting to survivors than overt brutality. Death became an assembly line. The camp processed approximately 2,000 people daily during peak operations. Samuel learned to recognize the signs: the sudden silence when transports arrived, the increased smoke from the crematorium chimneys, the way guards avoided eye contact after particularly large shipments. What sustained Samuel through months of horror was a growing determination to survive not for personal salvation, but to bear witness. He began memorizing names, faces, and details that others tried to forget. This mental documentation would later prove crucial when the world questioned whether such systematic evil was possible. But survival at Treblinka required more than memory and determination. It demanded an understanding of the camp's hidden vulnerabilities, the small spaces between orders where humanity might still exist, and the growing network of resistance that was quietly planning something unprecedented. The guards believed they controlled everything within the electrified fence. They calculated killing rates, managed logistics, and maintained order through terror. What they failed to recognize was that among their victims, a group of prisoners was methodically planning the one thing that had never been attempted at any Nazi death camp. Samuel Willenberg was about to become part of the most daring escape in Holocaust history. An uprising that would shake the foundations of the Nazi killing machine and create survivors whose testimonies would later challenge the world's comfortable assumptions about forgiveness and justice. But first, he had to survive the selection that would determine whether he lived to see another dawn or joined the smoke rising endlessly above the Polish countryside. The whispered conversation in the sorting barracks lasted exactly 4 minutes and 27 seconds, timed to the guard rotation that Samuel had memorized down to the second. Julian Chorążycki, a former Polish army officer, leaned close enough that Samuel could smell the carbolic soap they used to wash blood from clothing donations. This meeting would birth the most audacious plan in the history of Nazi death camps, but it required breaking every survival instinct that had kept prisoners alive. The wooden floor creaked under shifting weight as 12 men gathered in the dim light, filtering through gaps in the barracks walls. Outside, the sound of diesel engines masked their hushed planning, while the metallic taste of fear coated every word they spoke. Samuel's calloused hands gripped a piece of rusted wire he'd salvaged from a transport, his fingertips working it into a crude lockpick. "We have perhaps 2 weeks before the Soviets arrive," Chorążycki whispered, referencing intelligence smuggled in by new arrivals. "But 2 weeks means another 28,000 people will die. We cannot wait for liberation." The arithmetic of mass murder was simple and relentless. Treblinka operated with industrial efficiency, processing human lives at a rate that made individual survival meaningless. The only meaningful response was collective action that most prisoners considered suicide. Heinrich Brenner, unknowingly, had provided crucial intelligence during a moment of carelessness. While supervising the sorting detail, he'd mentioned that the guard armory contained 43 rifles, 17 pistols, and sufficient ammunition for a prolonged firefight. He'd been complaining about inventory duties, never imagining that prisoner ears were cataloging every detail. The Ukrainian guards changed shifts at 3:30 each afternoon, Samuel reported, his eidetic memory serving as the conspiracy's intelligence network. For exactly 11 minutes, the northeast watchtower stands empty. The German guards retreat to their quarters for coffee and reports. Samuel's role had evolved beyond mere witness. His perfect recall made him invaluable for mapping guard patterns, timing rotations, and identifying the camp's operational vulnerabilities. But planning an uprising required more than intelligence. It demanded accepting that most participants would die in the attempt. From the Treblinka investigation files, post-war Polish commission. Prisoner testimony indicates revolt planning began July 1943. Estimated 47 active conspirators among 600 camp inmates. The plan was staggering in its simplicity and certain in its casualties. Prisoners would overwhelm guards during the shift change, seize weapons from the armory, and create enough chaos to allow mass escape through the perimeter fence. Success meant hundreds might flee into the surrounding forest. Failure meant immediate execution for everyone involved. "Most of us will die today," Chorążycki stated matter-of-factly during their final planning meeting, August 2nd, 1943. "But some will survive to tell the world what happened here. That testimony is worth more than our individual lives." The uprising's moral mathematics were brutal but clear. Trading certain death for possible survival, exchanging passive victimhood for active resistance, transforming from witnesses to participants in their own liberation. Death had become familiar. Freedom remained theoretical. Samuel volunteered for the most dangerous assignment, disabling the telephone lines that connected Treblinka to German command centers. This task required approaching the administrative building where Heinrich Brenner and other guards maintained their daily operations, exposing himself during daylight hours when discovery meant immediate execution. But the conspiracy faced an unexpected complication. Word of the planned uprising had leaked to capos, prisoner guards who collaborated with the Nazis in exchange for better treatment. Some of these collaborators faced a terrible choice: warn the German authorities and preserve their privileged positions, or remain silent and risk death alongside their fellow prisoners. What happened next would test every assumption about loyalty, survival, and moral choice under impossible circumstances. The uprising was scheduled for 4 p.m. August 2, 1943. The weather was unseasonably cool, with clouds that might provide cover for escaping prisoners. Samuel spent the morning memorizing faces of guards and capos, creating a mental record of who participated in genocide and who resisted. He understood that survival was only the first step. Bearing witness would require remembering not just the crimes, but the names and faces of those who committed them. The clock in the camp commandant's office showed 3:47 p.m. when the first shot was fired, 13 minutes ahead of schedule. The uprising had begun, triggered by an unexpected guard patrol that forced the conspirators' hand. Samuel was about to discover whether courage could overcome impossible odds, and whether survival was worth the price of witnessing humanity's capacity for both ultimate evil and ultimate resistance. The crack of gunfire shattered the afternoon quiet as prisoner Zelo Bloch fell with a bullet in his chest, his blood seeping into the dust outside the camp armory. The uprising at Treblinka had begun 13 minutes early, and Samuel Willenberg was sprinting toward the telephone lines when the world exploded around him. This moment would determine whether the Nazi killing machine's perfect record of control could be broken by the very people it sought to erase. The metallic taste of gunpowder filled the air while the acrid smell of burning buildings mixed with pine resin from the surrounding forest. Samuel's bare feet pounded against packed earth as shouts erupted in German, Polish, and Yiddish, creating a cacophony of chaos that the camp's rigid order had never experienced. His fingers fumbled with wire cutters stolen from the carpentry shop, racing to sever communications before Heinrich Brenner and the other guards could call for reinforcements. Dr. Choronzhitsky's plan was unraveling exactly as predicted. The early gunshot had triggered premature action, but the core strategy remained intact. Overwhelm the guards during their most vulnerable moment and create enough chaos for mass escape. Behind Samuel, 46 prisoners charged the armory with tools, transformed into weapons. Hammers became clubs, scissors turned into daggers, and workshop files sharpened into crude spears. They moved with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that failure meant immediate death, but success offered only the possibility of survival. Heinrich Brenner emerged from the administrative building at exactly 3:51 p.m., his Luger drawn, but his face showing confusion rather than anger. He had trained for prisoner infractions, not open rebellion. The sight of inmates attacking guards shattered his understanding of the camp's natural order. "Halt! Zurück!" Brenner shouted, but his words disappeared in the growing cacophony. A prisoner named Rudolf Masaryk, armed with a stolen axe, charged past Brenner toward the main gate, his war cry echoing across the compound. The telephone lines snapped under Samuel's wire cutters at 3:53 p.m., severing Treblinka's connection to the outside world. For the first time since the camp's construction, the guards faced their victims without the certainty of overwhelming support. From the Treblinka survivor testimonies, Yad Vashem archives. The uprising lasted approximately 30 minutes. Estimated casualties: 17 German guards, 23 Ukrainian auxiliaries, and 67 prisoners killed during escape attempts. The armory fell to the prisoners at 3:57 p.m. after a brief but vicious struggle. Samuel watched from his position near the communications building as inmates emerged carrying rifles, pistols, and ammunition belts. For a few moments, the power dynamic that had defined Treblinka completely reversed. But the geography of genocide favored the oppressors. The camp's design, with its multiple fenced sections and guard towers, created kill zones that channeled escaping prisoners into predetermined firing positions. What appeared to be chaos was actually functioning exactly as the architects had intended. Rebellion had its own mathematics. Heinrich Brenner found himself trapped between the burning administrative building and a group of armed prisoners. His Luger held 8 rounds. He faced 12 men who had nothing left to lose. The moment encapsulated the uprising's central contradiction: individual courage confronting systematic oppression. Samuel made a choice that would haunt him for decades. Instead of joining the assault on the guard quarters, he ran toward the women's section, where his sister Tamara was imprisoned. Personal loyalty overwhelmed revolutionary strategy, a decision that saved his life, but cost others theirs. The women's barracks sat behind a separate fence, designed to prevent contact between male and female prisoners. Samuel reached the wire at 4:02 p.m., his bolt cutters working frantically as rifle fire intensified behind him. Through the fence, he could see Tamara's face, her eyes wide with disbelief that escape might actually be possible. What happened next would become one of the uprising's most documented moments. As Samuel cut through the wire, Heinrich Brenner appeared behind him, Luger raised, finger on the trigger. The guard who had supervised Samuel's work details for months now faced the choice of killing a prisoner who had never directly challenged him. "Stop," Brenner commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Move away from the fence." Samuel turned, wire cutters still in his hand, and looked directly into the eyes of his captor. "My sister is behind this fence. I will not leave her." The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but those moments contained the entire moral universe of the Holocaust. Guard and prisoner, oppressor and victim, facing each other while the camp burned around them. Brenner's finger tightened on the trigger. Samuel didn't move. Tamara pressed against the fence, her fingers touching her brother's through the wire. The shot that broke the standoff came from behind Brenner. Another prisoner, armed with a captured rifle, had fired from 30 yards away. The bullet missed Brenner, but shattered the fence post beside Samuel's head, sending splinters into his cheek and breaking the moment's terrible tension. Brenner dove for cover. Samuel pulled Tamara through the gap in the fence. Together, they ran toward the forest that had seemed impossible to reach just minutes before. But escape was only the beginning of a different kind of hell, one that would test whether survival was worth the memories it required carrying, and whether witnessing genocide created an obligation that could never be fulfilled or forgiven. The forest waited ahead, promising freedom but demanding a price that Samuel wouldn't fully understand until he faced Heinrich Brenner across a conference table 65 years later. Pine needles crunched under Samuel's bare feet as machine gun fire erupted behind them, the muzzle flashes illuminating the darkening Polish forest like deadly fireflies. His sister Tamara stumbled beside him, her prison dress catching on thorns that drew blood she couldn't afford to lose. This chase would determine whether the Treblinka uprising's survivors could transform their brief moment of rebellion into lasting testimony against genocide. The forest floor felt spongy with decades of fallen leaves, while the sharp scent of pine resin mixed with cordite from the ongoing battle at the camp. Samuel's lungs burned as he guided Tamara deeper into the woods, his fingers still clutching the wire cutters that had freed her from the fence. Behind them, searchlights swept through the trees like mechanical eyes hunting for escaped prey. Heinrich Brenner had survived the uprising with a dislocated shoulder and 17 stitches across his forehead, injuries that would leave permanent scars. But unlike the prisoners he'd guarded, Brenner's wounds would heal in military hospitals, while he provided testimony to SS investigators determined to prevent future rebellions. "They came at us like animals," Brenner reported to SS Oberfuhrer Globoknik on August 5, 1943. "Completely without warning, we had no indication of organized resistance." His testimony contained a crucial omission. Brenner had faced Samuel Willenberg at the fence and chosen not to shoot, a moment of hesitation that contradicted his sworn duty as a concentration camp guard. This detail would haunt him for decades, not from guilt over potential murder, but from shame over failing to execute orders. The forest provided temporary sanctuary, but promised slow death. Samuel and Tamara joined 43 other escapees who'd survived the initial chase, forming small groups that moved separately to avoid detection. They had no food, no weapons, and no knowledge of which local Poles might offer help, versus those who would betray escapees for Nazi rewards. From the Wehrmacht Garrison Report, Malkinia, August 7, 1943. Forest sweeps continue. 12 insurgents captured and executed. Estimated 25 to 30 still at large. Local population warned against providing assistance. The mathematics of survival were brutal. Without food, most escapees would weaken within a week. Without local support, they faced exposure, starvation, and systematic hunting by German patrols with tracking dogs. The forest that had seemed like salvation began to resemble an open-air prison. Samuel's eidetic memory, which had made him valuable in the camp's sorting barracks, now served as their navigation system. He'd memorized maps from his pre-war geography studies, remembering railroad lines, river crossings, and village locations that might offer sanctuary or supplies. "We move only at night," Samuel whispered to the group during their first forest council. "Sleep in pairs, always with one person awake. Trust no one we haven't known since before the war." The rules were harsh but necessary. Polish villagers faced execution for helping escaped prisoners, creating moral complexity where survival meant betraying basic human decency. Some locals genuinely wanted to help, but couldn't risk their families. Others saw opportunities for profit or settling old scores. Survival demanded becoming predators. On their fourth night in the forest, Samuel's group encountered Maria Kowalski, a Polish farmer's daughter who brought bread and information about German patrol patterns. Her assistance came with terrible conditions, sexual favors from Tamara in exchange for continued food supplies. This confrontation revealed the moral erosion that survival demanded. Tamara looked at her brother with eyes that had already seen too much, then nodded acceptance. Some prices were paid in dignity rather than blood, but both currencies spent the same. "Do what you must," Samuel whispered, hating himself for the words. "Survive. Bear witness. Nothing else matters." The next morning, Maria brought more than bread. She carried news that Samuel Willenberg was now listed among the most wanted escapees, with a reward of 500 zloty for information leading to his capture. His perfect memory and knowledge of camp operations made him particularly valuable to German interrogators. But Maria also brought hope. Soviet forces were advancing faster than German reports indicated. The front lines lay perhaps 60 kilometers east, close enough that artillery could sometimes be heard on quiet nights. Liberation might be weeks away rather than months. Samuel made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of continuing to hide, he would begin documenting everything he'd witnessed at Treblinka. Using charcoal and bark, he started creating detailed maps of the camp, lists of guard names, and descriptions of the killing process that Germans insisted didn't exist. These crude documents, hidden in a hollow tree trunk, would become some of the first physical evidence of systematic genocide. Samuel understood that survival without testimony was merely postponed death. His obligation extended beyond personal safety to historical truth. Heinrich Brenner, meanwhile, had been transferred to administrative duties in Berlin while his injuries healed. The Treblinka uprising had ended his direct participation in genocide, but it had also created an obsession with the prisoners who'd escaped his control. 65 years later, this obsession would drive him to seek out the survivors he'd failed to kill, searching for absolution from the very people he'd helped torture. But forgiveness, Samuel would learn, was not a commodity that could be purchased with late-life remorse. The forest held its secrets through winter, spring, and summer. But eventually, even the deepest woods must give up their dead and their living, forcing choices that would echo across decades. Soviet artillery shells whistled overhead as Samuel Willenberg emerged from 18 months in the Polish wilderness, his skeletal frame casting sharp shadows in the February sunlight of 1945. Liberation had finally arrived, but the young man who had escaped Treblinka no longer existed. This moment would reveal that surviving genocide was only the first challenge. Living with the memories would prove far more complex than anyone imagined. The thawed ground squelched beneath Samuel's makeshift boots, while the acrid smell of cordite mixed with wood smoke from burning German supply depots. His fingertips, permanently stained with charcoal from documenting camp atrocities, trembled as Soviet soldiers approached his forest hideout near the village of Kosov-Laki. After months of hiding from every uniform, distinguishing liberators from occupiers required a leap of faith that survival had nearly erased. Amerikansky? Angliski? The lead Soviet soldier asked, his rifle lowered but ready. Samuel's appearance, hollow cheeks, 1,000-yard stare, clothes held together with pine sap and determination, marked him clearly as someone who had endured the unimaginable. Żyd, Samuel replied in Polish. Jew. The word carried weight that transcended nationality, religion, or politics. It identified him as a member of a people that Hitler had tried to erase completely. The soldier's expression shifted to something approaching reverence. Soviet forces had discovered several concentration camps during their westward advance, but Treblinka's remains told a story of industrial murder that challenged human comprehension. Samuel represented living proof of crimes that the world was only beginning to understand. From the Soviet Liberation Command Report, February 23, 1945. Survivor testimony indicates systematic extermination facility. Estimated victim count, 875,000. Physical evidence destroyed by retreating Germans. Samuel's sister Tamara had died 3 weeks before liberation, succumbing to pneumonia after their food supply was cut off by increased German patrols. Her final words to Samuel were not about survival or resistance, but about memory. Remember their names. Remember their faces. Don't let them disappear twice. This obligation to remember would define Samuel's post-war existence. Unlike other survivors who sought to rebuild normal lives, Samuel became a professional witness, dedicating himself to documenting Nazi crimes with the same methodical precision he'd once used to memorize guard rotations. Liberation brought unexpected moral complexity. The American and British forces establishing displaced persons camps operated with genuine compassion, but they also brought assumptions about trauma, recovery, and justice that didn't match survivors' lived experiences. Well-meaning officials encouraged survivors to move forward and rebuild their lives, without understanding that some experiences couldn't be integrated into normal existence. They want us to forgive and forget, Samuel wrote in his first post-war diary entry, March 15, 1945. But forgetting dishonors the dead, and forgiveness belongs to God. not to men who participated in genocide. Samuel's refusal to embrace healing narratives marked him as difficult among camp administrators who preferred survivors who could demonstrate resilience through conventional recovery. His insistence on documenting specific crimes, naming individual perpetrators, and preserving detailed testimony made bureaucrats uncomfortable. Memory became his weapon. Heinrich Brenner, meanwhile, had surrendered to American forces near Munich in May 1945. During his initial interrogation, he minimized his role at Treblinka, claiming administrative duties rather than direct participation in murder. His strategy worked. Brenner was classified as a low-priority war criminal and released after 18 months in an Allied detention facility. This bureaucratic oversight would haunt post-war justice efforts. Thousands of concentration camp guards received lenient treatment or escaped prosecution entirely by claiming they were merely following orders. The complexity of determining individual guilt within systematic genocide overwhelmed Allied prosecutors focused on high-ranking Nazi officials. Samuel spent the immediate post-war years traveling between displaced persons camps, collecting testimony from other Treblinka survivors. His eidetic memory made him invaluable to war crimes investigators, but his emotional detachment concerned mental health workers who couldn't understand that some trauma doesn't heal, it just becomes manageable. By 1948, Samuel had relocated to Tel Aviv, where he established a small archive dedicated to preserving Treblinka documentation. His modest apartment became a pilgrimage site for other survivors seeking to record their experiences before memory faded or death claimed additional witnesses. "We are the library of the dead," Samuel told visiting journalists. "Every survivor carries thousands of stories that will disappear when we do. Documentation is not therapy, it's obligation." The establishment of Israel provided Samuel with purpose beyond personal survival. Building a Jewish state offered concrete response to genocide, proving that Hitler's final solution had failed. But statehood also brought pressure to focus on the future, rather than dwelling on past trauma. Samuel resisted this pressure with characteristic stubbornness. He continued documenting Nazi crimes, tracking down perpetrators who had escaped justice, and building legal cases that might eventually bring war criminals to trial. His work was methodical, obsessive, and largely thankless. Heinrich Brenner, living under his real name in Bavaria, had rebuilt his life as a small-town insurance agent. His wartime service remained secret, known only to his immediate family. Brenner's post-war existence was comfortable, anonymous, and haunted by dreams that grew more vivid with age. By the 1970s, Brenner had developed a peculiar obsession with Holocaust documentation, reading survivor memoirs and attending lectures about concentration camps. This engagement with his past began as morbid curiosity, but evolved into something approaching psychological necessity. Brenner had begun to understand that his comfortable post-war life was built on unconfronted crimes, and that his aging conscience would eventually demand some form of accounting for his participation in genocide. The collision between Samuel's mission to document truth and Brenner's need for absolution was inevitable. But the form it would take would shock both men when they finally faced each other across that conference table in Berlin. The telephone rang in Samuel Willenberg's Tel Aviv apartment at 11:43 p.m. on January 9, 2007, shattering decades of carefully maintained anonymity. The voice on the other end spoke German with a Bavarian accent that Samuel recognized instantly, despite 64 years of separation. This call would force Samuel to confront whether his life's mission of bearing witness included facing the very people whose crimes he had spent decades documenting. The static of international connection crackled through the phone line, while the familiar smell of archive dust filled Samuel's study, where thousands of documents covered every available surface. His arthritic fingers gripped the receiver as Heinrich Brenner's aged voice carried across continents, trembling with emotions that Samuel couldn't immediately identify as fear, guilt, or desperate hope. "I know you remember me," Brenner said without preamble. "I was at Treblinka. I supervised your work detail. I have been searching for you for 15 years. Samuel's first instinct was to hang up, but his historian's mind required more information. How had Brenner found him? What did this contact mean for other survivors who had built new lives under assumed identities? How many other perpetrators were conducting similar searches? "Why?" Samuel asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Because I need to speak with you, face to face. There are things I must say before I die." Brenner had indeed been searching for Treblinka survivors since the early 1990s, hiring private investigators and consulting Holocaust documentation centers across Europe and Israel. His quest had become obsessive, driven by nightmares that intensified with age and a growing awareness that his comfortable post-war life had been built on unconfronted crimes. From Heinrich Brenner's medical records, Munich General Hospital, December 2006. Patient reports severe insomnia, recurring nightmares involving scenes of violence, refuses psychiatric medication, states he deserves to suffer. The call represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between perpetrator and victim. For 60 years, Samuel had been the pursuer, documenting crimes and tracking war criminals. Now one of those criminals was actively seeking him out, reversing the dynamic that had defined Samuel's post-war existence. "I will not provide you with absolution," Samuel warned. "If that's what you're seeking, call a priest." "I'm not seeking forgiveness," Brenner replied, though his voice suggested otherwise. "I'm seeking understanding. I need to know if you can explain to me how I became the person I was." The conversation lasted 18 minutes. Brenner provided details about his post-war life, marriage, children, career, that painted him as an ordinary man who had participated in extraordinary evil. He described his growing obsession with Holocaust history, his attendance at memorial events, his financial contributions to Jewish charities. Some guilt metastasizes over time. Samuel agreed to the meeting, but not from any desire for reconciliation. His motivation was purely documentary. This represented an unprecedented opportunity to interrogate a perpetrator about the psychological mechanisms that enabled genocide. The conversation would be filmed, recorded, and archived as part of his ongoing mission to preserve testimony. "I will meet with you," Samuel said finally, "but understand that I will ask questions you may not want to answer, and I will not pretend that time has erased what you participated in." The documentary crew that arranged the Berlin meeting had expected a different kind of encounter. Director Klaus Hoffmann envisioned a story about healing, reconciliation, and the human capacity for forgiveness. His funding depended on delivering a narrative that audiences could find emotionally satisfying rather than morally challenging. "These meetings usually end with handshakes and tears," Hoffman explained to Samuel during pre-filming interviews. "Survivors find peace through forgiveness. It's a powerful message of human redemption." Samuel's response was characteristically blunt. "You're confusing therapy with history. My purpose is not to heal Heinrich Brenner's conscience, but to extract information about how ordinary men become complicit in genocide." The weeks leading up to the Berlin meeting revealed the complex ecosystem that had developed around Holocaust memory. Brenner had connected with support groups for perpetrators' families, organizations that helped war criminals' descendants process inherited guilt. Samuel had been contacted by trauma counselors who wanted to prepare him for the emotional impact of confronting his former captor. Both men rejected these interventions, preferring to face each other without mediation or therapeutic framework. Their meeting would be a raw encounter between perpetrator and victim, unfiltered by the healing narratives that society preferred to impose on such confrontations. Samuel spent the days before departure reviewing his Treblinka documentation, refreshing his memory of specific details about Brenner's role in the camp's operations. His preparation was forensic rather than emotional, treating the upcoming encounter as an interrogation rather than a reconciliation. The flight to Berlin marked Samuel's first return to German soil since his liberation in 1945. As the plane descended toward Tegel Airport, he could see the transformed landscape below, modern buildings rising where concentration camps had once operated, highways connecting cities where Jewish communities had been destroyed. But some transformations remained incomplete. Heinrich Brenner waited in that conference room, carrying 64 years of unprocessed guilt, expecting that his victim might provide the absolution that his comfortable post-war life had failed to deliver. Samuel entered that room carrying something far more dangerous: the absolute certainty that some crimes exist beyond the possibility of forgiveness, and the courage to say so regardless of what the cameras expected him to perform. The collision between these incompatible needs would create a moment that challenged every assumption about victim-perpetrator relationships and forced audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, memory, and the limits of human reconciliation. The conference room fell silent for 47 seconds after Samuel Willenberg's definitive no echoed off the sterile walls, while Heinrich Brenner's face crumpled like aged parchment. This moment would redefine how the world understood the relationship between victims and perpetrators, challenging the comfortable narrative that healing requires forgiveness. Samuel's refusal to absolve his former tormentor would ripple through survivor communities worldwide, creating a new vocabulary for moral courage that didn't depend on reconciliation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while the scent of stale coffee grew stronger in the cramped space, mixing with the metallic taste of unresolved tension. Samuel's weathered hands remained folded on the polished table as Brenner's shoulders shook with sobs that carried 64 years of suppressed guilt. The documentary cameras captured every second of this collision between expectation and reality. "I have lived with this burden every day," Brenner whispered through his tears. "Every meal tastes like ash. Every night brings nightmares. How can you not forgive me when I am clearly suffering?" Samuel's response would become legendary among Holocaust survivors. "Your suffering is not my responsibility. Your guilt is not my burden to relieve. The dead cannot forgive you, and I will not speak for them." The meeting ended 12 minutes later when Brenner fled the room, his search for absolution having produced only deeper confrontation with his unforgivable past. Samuel remained seated, continuing to answer the documentary crew's questions with the same methodical precision he had brought to decades of testimony. From the Berlin Documentation Center final report, February 14, 2008. Subject W maintained consistent position throughout encounter. No indication of reconciliation achieved. Perpetrator departed premises in apparent distress. The documentary aired 8 months later, creating international controversy. Audiences accustomed to redemption narratives found Samuel's uncompromising stance difficult to process. Some criticized him for cruelty, others praised his moral clarity. The debate revealed society's deep discomfort with victims who refused to provide the forgiveness that would allow everyone else to move forward. Samuel became an accidental spokesman for what scholars termed militant memory, the position that some crimes transcend forgiveness and that victims have no obligation to heal their perpetrators' consciences. His stance influenced legal proceedings, therapeutic approaches, and public discourse about genocide survivors. The refusal sparked global conversation. Heinrich Brenner died 6 weeks after the filmed encounter, found in his Munich apartment with Samuel's photograph from the meeting clutched in his hand. His suicide note contained no admission of guilt, only repeated pleas for understanding that would never come. Even in death, he sought absolution from the very people he had helped torture. Samuel continued his work until his death in 2016 at age 94, never wavering from his position that forgiveness was not his to give. His archive in Tel Aviv became a pilgrimage site for survivors who had been pressured to move on and found strength in his example of uncompromising memory. "Some wounds are meant to remain open," Samuel had written in his final diary entry. "They remind us what healing actually costs and who should bear that price." His legacy challenged therapeutic culture's emphasis on closure and reconciliation, asserting that victims have the right to maintain their anger, their pain, and their refusal to absolve those who participated in their destruction. This position became known as Willenberg's standard, the principle that genocide survivors owe nothing to their perpetrators, including forgiveness. The documentary continues to be screened at universities, trauma centers, and human rights organizations worldwide. Its central message, that moral courage sometimes requires refusing what others expect, has influenced approaches to transitional justice, therapeutic intervention, and historical reconciliation. Samuel's apartment in Tel Aviv was preserved as a museum after his death, containing 40,000 documents related to Treblinka and other Nazi crimes. Visitors often ask guides whether Samuel ever regretted his harsh treatment of Heinrich Brenner. The answer, according to his personal writings, was unequivocal. Regret belonged to perpetrators, not to those who survived their crimes. The final irony emerged during estate proceedings. Brenner had left substantial money to Holocaust memorial organizations, apparently believing that financial contributions might accomplish the absolution that personal encounters had failed to provide. Samuel's foundation refused the donation, maintaining that money could not purchase moral clean slate. Today, some visitors to the Treblinka memorial site claim they can still hear two voices arguing in the wind that sweeps across the killing fields, one pleading for forgiveness, the other eternally refusing to grant it. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.